Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on the collaborative analysis of video. I am David Woods. I am the author and publisher of Transana. I just want to let everyone know that I am recording today's webinar. To start things off, I would like to introduce my collaborator, Zeynab. Why don't you take a second and just introduce yourself to the group?
Good morning, everybody. So my name is Zeynab, and thank you for David for letting me be part of this. So I am a researcher in education and the CEO of Advanced Video-Based Research. So our main objective in our company is training and consulting to help research and professionals using video data with field engineering, data collection, and archiving, relevant software choice for their analysis and production of results. Again, thank you, David, for making me part of that.
You're quite welcome. So just to let you know, I'm located in Wisconsin in the United States, and Zeynab, you're in what, Pennsylvania?
No, North Carolina.
North Carolina. I knew it was somewhere on the East Coast. So,
Yes.
so she and I are about 1,000 miles apart, and we're going to demonstrate today what we would do to work together on projects. Zeynab's been part of a number of international projects, which is one of the reasons that I invited her to join me today. It helps to have a collaborator to show off a collaborative system, but she also has a lot of experience with that. Okay, I'm going to start with a brief introduction to Transana, which is the software that we're talking about today. And then Zeynab and I will show you a little bit about some of the steps involved in working collaboratively. I would invite you all to interrupt us at any point that you have questions. And so as questions come up, please do interrupt. It makes the flow of the webinar a little less smooth, but I think it gets important information out in a more timely manner. So you're invited to interrupt with your questions, although I will also stay at the end of the webinar and answer questions as long as people have questions to ask. Okay, I am sharing my screen right now, and you can see Transana in its startup form. You can see that it has a number of windows. So I'm going to go ahead and load a little bit of data just to show a little bit about how Transana works. I'm loading video data here that I have already coded. And let me just play a little bit of that video so that you can see a little bit about how Transana works specifically with video.
This is the core they started with, and they want it to look like that. I'm going to first flip it up. Watch what happens. Okay? Now I'm going to go back to where we started, and now I'm going to flip it down. What happens each time?
It goes to the same thing.
So you can see that when working with video data, you have in the upper right-hand corner the Transana's media window where you can see your video player. If you're working with audio-only data, then this window is still there because you can use it as a controller for the audio to play and pause the audio, to position the audio, tasks like that. You can see in the lower left-hand corner the document window. And in this particular case, I'm working with the verbatim transcript of the media file. You don't have to have a transcript to work with media with Transana, but it's often a very useful tool. And one of the things that I hope you noticed as the video was playing was that there was a highlight in the transcript that moved along with the video, that the video and the transcript were linked together. And when working with video data, that's often a really, really helpful tool to have that transcript. The model of Transana for video data specifically is that the video is your primary data. The video is what you're analyzing. The transcript is a secondary piece of information that does not replace the video as the primary data. When I'm doing literature reviews for research that I work with, I see in articles all the time, you know, we recorded interviews, we created transcripts, we threw away our media files and analyzed the transcripts as text. And that is just crazy making for me. I just don't understand that as a research strategy because there's so much information in video beyond just the written words, a written record of what is spoken. There's inflection of the voice, there's facial expression, there's body posture, there's movement. There's often so much more information than can be conveyed in a transcript, that a transcript is a secondary and abstracted representation of the data provided by video. However, there are times when a transcript is very useful. It's very hard with video to find the bit that you're looking for. It is easier if you can remember some of the words that were spoken to find locations of the evidence that you want to analyze. So I know in this particular video that there's a discussion of symmetry. And if that's what I want to analyze today, I want to be able to type in part of that root word and do a search in my transcript for where they discuss symmetry. And okay, here I found the location where I want to start.
And Amanda, while she was listening to the story, said, "What's symmetrical?" Let's talk about that word, symmetrical. Who can share with the group? What do you think? What's your guess? What do you think it might have to do with? Paul, what's your guess?
So you can see that I can use the transcript as a way of locating in my video the section that I want to work on to analyze. So the transcript is a useful map. It is not a replacement for my data. I should emphasize at this point that I'm showing video right now because that is my favorite type of data. That's what I work mostly with. That's what I encourage people to work with because I think it's really, really powerful. But Transana works with a variety of other types of data as well. You can, for example, work with text-only data. You can import Word documents. You can import rich text files, text in a variety of formats, and analyze text in Transana. If you know how to analyze video as a more complicated case, you will know how to analyze text in Transana because the kinds of things you do with text are very similar to what you do with transcripts when working with video. Transana can work with still image data. It has some unique tools for marking up images as a way of analytically understanding the visual layer of data. So if you have photographs, if you have scans of student work, for example, or scans of documents, if you have still images, you can bring those into Transana and add those as part of your data. If you use online survey tools and have open-ended questions, you can import the data from those survey tools, and Transana will do a little bit of preparation in terms of formatting your data in ways that are very useful to get you started in the analysis of free-form answers from online surveys. In the next release of Transana, we'll be able to import and analyze PDF data, as that's becoming a much more common and much more important source of text-based data that people are analyzing. What's different about PDFs from regular text is that PDFs often have a visual element. The layout in a PDF, the graphics in a PDF can often be important sources of information that one might want to bring into the analytic process. And Transana will allow some unique tools for bringing the visual aspects of PDF, as well as getting the text out of PDFs to be able to analyze that information as well. So Transana works with a variety of different formats of data. I'm showing video right now as one example of the kinds of things that one might collaboratively analyze. But you can analyze all types of data in Transana, and you can collaborate on that analysis of all types of data in Transana.
Excuse me, David.
Yes?
There's a question about transcripts.
Okay.
Did Transana create the transcript? If not, then how was it linked to the videos?
Okay, that's an excellent question. Transana does not provide any sort of voice recognition, speech recognition capability. First off, I don't find that a particularly reliable way of transcribing. I find that the data I get out of voice recognition programs tends to be 75, 80% accurate. It tends not to have formatting. It tends not to have punctuation. It tends not to have speaker identification. It tends to have very poor recognition of where sentences begin and end, things like that. So while I do use that tech, I will use voice recognition on my media files before I bring them into Transana, and I will then import those transcripts as a place to start. But I find that I still have to spend a fair amount of time cleaning those transcripts up, getting them to the point where they accurately reflect what's in the video. So Transana does not currently provide that sort of speech recognition itself. It does allow for you to import those speech recognition transcripts if you have them, and there are tools for converting the time codes, for example, that come from those sorts of transcripts. But Transana also has the capacity to allow you to transcribe your own data from scratch. So there are tools in the document window that allow you to control the media playback while you are working. And that's actually really helpful. That speeds the process of manual transcription up quite a bit because you never have to take your hands off of the keyboard. So there are a lot of projects that use Transana's manual transcription capabilities to facilitate that process. Another thing that I want to point out is that a lot of research data that people will be analyzing is highly confidential, that you can't just send it out to some external server to have voice recognition applied to it. And voice recognition is a technology so complicated that it's pretty much all done on large computers that are not local to where you're analyzing your data. So you have to send the data out. You have to share that data to have it processed for speech recognition. And that's often not allowed by your institutional review board. That's not permitted to share your data with an external company for the process of creating those transcripts. So there are many projects that hire undergraduates as transcribers, and undergraduates create very reliable transcripts in a reasonably cost-effective way. And so you can actually get a team of people working at the same time on transcribing a body of data, a collection of data, as an efficient way. So Transana provides tools for manual transcription as well. I think voice recognition is the way of the future, but I think the state of the art right now is if you are able to use voice recognition, if your IRB allows you to use voice recognition, you still need a tool like Transana to clean those transcripts up, to make them more accurate, to format them in a more readable way. And so there's always that manual element of turning a transcript from something that is challenging to something that that is more useful. I can actually show you that real quickly. I have a couple of examples here. Let's go to this. I'm going to show you. This is a BBC News piece that is part of an analysis I did a number of years ago. And it's a piece of data that I play with. So what you see here is 3 transcript representations. In the first one on the left is the manual transcription that I did of this news piece. The second one was done by a program called Dragon Dictate. And it's an attempt from a number of years ago. I admit this is almost 10 years old now. So this was state of the art a decade ago for speech recognition. And the third transcript, the one on the right, was done with software called Otter AI. That's a web-based speech recognition system where you submit your file and they return a transcript to you. And so let me play a little bit of this file, and you can look at the results of those 3 different methods of creating a transcript.
The Guardian.
The Observer's business editor is Heather Stewart. She says King, in effect, attacked the government's borrowing policy.
He certainly did. I think this is potentially pretty explosive stuff. There's a convention that the Bank of England doesn't talk directly about fiscal policy, just as the Treasury is now not really meant to pontificate on the subject of where interest rates should be. And yet King made a very direct intervention. He said if the economy recovers as rapidly as the government expected it to in its budget forecasts, that the deficit should be cut back. In other words, that public spending should be cut faster than the Treasury envisaged.
So what you can see here is that the transcription that I did myself using Transana is highly accurate, very readable, and all of that. The middle transcript is essentially useless, that it really did a very poor job of capturing the words, and there was a lot of inaccuracy. There's no formatting, there's poor punctuation. It's very difficult to work with. It took me longer to fix that transcript up and make it usable than it did just to transcribe from scratch. The third transcript, you can see that in fact the words were captured reasonably well. I've highlighted in other colors words that are incorrect, and you can see that the timing is not particularly accurate. And the other thing is that there are times when, in fact, the transcription is just wrong. For example, here at the bottom, we see that there's a discussion of somebody receiving a financial bonus of 130 pounds. That was in fact 130,000 pounds. That factor of 1,000 really explained the uproar about this particular banker receiving a huge bonus at a time when the economy was tanking, and the banks were being blamed for a worldwide economic recession. You see up here, the program describes something as a kind of non-painful process, when in fact it was an extremely painful process, that the voice recognition simply got it wrong. And so you definitely do not want to rely on voice recognition, even in its current iteration, as being an accurate representation of what your media file says. At the very least, you want to go through the data, listen to it carefully, and make corrections to the voice recognized transcript as you go. So, very long answer to what turns out was not a simple question at all, but that's fine. Okay, so I was talking, just doing the general introduction of Transana, talking about the media window, talked about the document window. I'll just, as an aside, point out that in fact, Transana allows you to work with multiple transcripts of the same data at the same time. That can be an incredibly powerful analytic technique for very difficult or layered data. If you want to know more about the analytic uses of that technique, I do occasionally have a webinar on advanced techniques in the analysis of data with Transana, where I go into greater depth of using that particular technique. There are also a number of articles and references on the website that you can find for more on that particular analytic technique, although that's really beyond the scope of this particular webinar. Back to our original data. Okay, above the document window, you see the Transana's visualization window, and that window serves two purposes. When there is media data in the system as the data that you're working on, you get a waveform diagram, and that can be very useful, particularly during transcription, but also at other times in the analytic process, to allow you to sort of see, if you will, the spoken words and see the flow of conversation across time. You can also see that there's an indication of coding. And as I move my mouse over these different bars, you can see what those bars represent in terms of the coding that has been applied to this data. So you can get a sense of the initial coding that has been done to a particular document, both as a way of getting an analytic understanding of what keywords or codes go together, but also at the beginning of what you've worked on and what you haven't worked on yet. I see that there's another question in the chat. Let's say that 3 people are working on transcribing video data from scratch. Can these 3 people access and work on the same transcript on Transana? Can multiple people edit the way you can in a Google Doc? The answer to that is no. You have to take turns. So one person can be editing a document at any given time. If a second person tries to edit the same document, you get a message about that. Zeynab, can you load the, you see the data I have loaded under the library classroom data, under flipping and symmetry and quilting. Can you load the English transcript and put it into edit mode, please?
Sure. I'm putting it in edit mode, and now I am writing in it.
Okay, now she's editing it. And you see that if I tell Transana I want to edit, I get this message that says that Zeynab is currently editing it, and I have to wait. So Zeynab, can you now stop editing that document?
Yes.
Save your changes and take it out of edit mode. And when I then,
Okay.
sorry, I'm going too fast.
Go ahead.
And so Zeynab is now finished with her edits. And if I go in, I'm now able to edit that document and carry on. If Zeynab had made changes to the visual part, that the transcript would have refreshed and shown those changes to me when I went in. So Transana enforces one person editing at a time, but if people are working different shifts, your second transcriber can pick up where your first transcriber left off in order to get work done. But the actual task of simultaneous editing is rather difficult to program, and I have not yet added that feature to Transana. I may at some point, but I think the system of taking turns editing works pretty well most of the time, and so I haven't invested the time it will take to add that simultaneous editing yet, although I probably will at some point in the future. Okay, so that's the visualization window. It shows you the waveform. It shows you coding that has been done. Obviously, if you're working with non-media data, it just shows you the coding component of that. And then the fourth window in Transana that I want to point to is in the lower right-hand corner, the data window. This is where you bring data into Transana. This shows you how your data is organized. It's got four primary sections. Libraries. When you bring data into Transana, you bring that data into a library. So libraries are places that you store source data that you bring into the program. The function of libraries is an organizational structure. The more complicated your data, the more you will use libraries to keep track of things, to be able to find things. Transana is designed to work with extremely large data sets. When I first started working on this, there was a project that had 13,000 hours worth of video that they wanted to analyze, and they had trouble just finding an individual file to analyze. And so we built this organizational system so that they could keep track of that much data. You see that I have a variety of different categories of very different types of data that I use during my demonstrations to respond to questions, as you've already seen. And so that's the function that libraries serve in my system. Transana doesn't care how you organize your data, but it does ask for at least a base level of organization to make sense out of the data. So libraries are for raw data. The way one does qualitative analysis in a sort of abstract, atheoretical way, in the way that a computer approaches it, is one makes selection in media files or in transcripts or in text or in images, and one applies coding, analytic keywords to those different selections, and that's how we attach analytic meaning to portions of data, and we then go through a process of making sense of that. So there's a categorization process through the act of coding. Transana also supports a sort of more visual system of categorization of data that is very similar to coding, but not exactly the same as coding. And so all analytic selections end up in collections in Transana, and collections are conceptual buckets, if you will. They're places that one can put similar types of data as one is going through the analytic process. I find that with time, these collections become theoretically oriented and represent different ideas or different themes in data. And so collections are organizational. They're the selections of data that we have coded or categorized as ways of identifying what is analytically meaningful. And we manipulate those selections within the collection structure to perform a variety of different analytic acts as we increase our understanding of what our data has to tell us and move towards the theory that is the whole point of qualitative analysis. And so we'll be coming back to collections in this webinar as we demonstrate different portions of working with data. I see that I'm almost a half hour into the webinar and I'm still on the introduction, so I'm going to speed things up a little bit. Keywords are where we enter and maintain a coding system within Transana, and so you can create a variety of different categories of codes and then apply those codes throughout the data analysis. So keywords are for the development of your coding structure. Search is, as the name implied, an analytic tool. One searches the coding that one has applied to data as a way of understanding how different themes are expressed within the data that you're working on as a tool for analyzing that data. So those are the four basic categories. When you perform a search in Transana, what Transana returns is quotes and clips and snapshots within collections, and that all occurs in the search node so that you can understand the results of your search and see how they fit into your analysis overall. So that's the data window. Those are the four windows of Transana that one uses to perform analysis. So that being said, we're actually here to talk about collaboration. Now that we have a sense of how Transana works, we can get a sense of how collaboration works. So Zeynab and I are going to do a quick collaboration. I am going to create a library, and I'm just going to call it Webinar Library. And within that library, let me just set math concepts keyword group. And so I've now created a library, and within that library, I am going to add an episode, which means I am going to go out to my hard drive. I'm going to locate a particular video file, and I'm going to bring that video file in. It's the demo file because we're demonstrating. And I'm going to bring that in, and Zeynab and I will do a super quick and non-meaningful analysis of that data. So I'm going to apply the code, math concepts geometry. This is a geometry lesson. That's what this data is about. Every single selection we make from this data, I want tagged with geometry so that I can compare it to other types of lessons that might be in the data set that I'm working on. So this is essentially a default code that gets applied to everything that that we create from this, and you'll see the importance of that in a minute. So I've now added my video. Transana wants a transcript. Well, I happen to already have a transcript of that. Nobody wants to watch me transcribe that anyway. That would not be a good use of our time. And so I now have brought that data in to Transana. But the act of me doing it here on my screen, what has happened on Zeynab's screen in North Carolina is that Webinar Library has been added to her list of libraries in her copy of Transana. Demo has been added to that library as an episode, that is to say, as a media file. And the demo transcript has been added as a transcript for that. So Zeynab can now load this data that I have put into Transana, and she and I are going to simultaneously do some analysis.
I see all the things that you did already, David, here. So I see the demo and I see it, the transcript, and now I'll be creating a collection and a code.
All right, what are you going to call your collection there, Zeynab?
Oh, I will call it mass interaction questions. So I will create a collection, and while I'm doing this, we'll do it math interaction. So it's not meaningful. So what I'm doing now is really just an example to show you precisely what's going on. So I created my collection called math interaction, and I will now
And there it is. You can see Math Interactions now on my screen. I didn't do anything to create that. That just popped up because Zeynab created it on her computer so that we're able to see the work that each of us is doing as it happens. And I see that Jerry has asked a question in the chat. Is Zeynab's library saved locally on her computer? And the answer to that is no. Specifically in the multi-user version of Transana, I was anticipating this kind of question. So I have my answer ready to that. This is another long answer to a short question. When you're working with a single user version of Transana, everything is stored locally on your own computer. But when you're working on the multi-user version of Transana, data storage gets centralized. So we have here a diagram of a complex collaborative analysis. We've got local network 1, which might be the university that is hosting the research. And you see that there are a number of users on local network 1, and that those 3 users on local network 1 share media library 1. And each of those users has a copy of Transana, and you can see that they have a mixture of Windows and Macintosh computers. Local network 2 is a second university, perhaps, or a separate location. Location in this term is defined by local area network boundaries for technical reasons that we don't need to go into. But you see that each network has an internet connection to a Transana server. Transana Server is a shared resource across locations. Notice in the lower right-hand corner, we have individual user 3. That's somebody who maybe is working from home or is at a conference or whatever, or is traveling or in a coffee shop and wants to be able to get into the shared data as well. Notice that local area network has a copy of the media library. Local network 2, the second location, has a copy of the media library shared amongst the users on that network, and that the individual user also has a copy of the media library. Video files are very, very large. They do not transfer across the internet with the kind of efficiency that the analysis of video requires. And so Transana has a hybrid model where much of the data is stored in a central server, but in fact, media files specifically, so video files, audio files, still image files, and when the time comes that feature is enabled in Transana, PDFs as well, are stored in media libraries, which are shared across local networks, but the data is too large to share across the internet boundaries. The internet pipeline is just too slow for sharing giant files. And so there are parallel systems for sharing the data. So Zeynab's library is actually, the library itself is stored in the database on the Transana server. And there's a tool called the message server that communicates between all of the copies of Transana running. So when I created the library here as one of the users on network 1, that got created in the database, and the message server sent a message to Zeynab's copy of Transana and said, hey, there's a new library here. And Zeynab's copy of Transana popped up that new library set and added it to Zeynab's screen for her to see. Now, the media file that I added in that library was part of a second system. All right, so we've got the local users. Each user has their own copy of Transana. That's the green rectangles here. Each user has their own copy of Transana. We then have the server as a second component. The server is made up of the database and the message server. Those two resources are on a centralized computer that everybody connects to over the network, and that shares all of the abstracted information, the transcripts, the libraries, the collections, the coding, all of that information. But then there is the media sharing system, and that is the blue boxes. The media sharing system is how media files are shared. And we use tools like Dropbox or Box or Google Drive or OneDrive, or there are a host of different media sharing systems out there. And so if I add something to my media library, the media synchronization server then makes sure that that is copied to Zeynab's media library and to the media library at the other location. That's a slower process because of the size of the files. And that's actually something that is set up parallel to the Transana server, but generally using an existing service. There are also ways of setting it up for manual copy. So the answer, the question is Zeynab's library saved locally? The answer is that Zeynab has a local copy of the media library, which gets its data through the what we're labeled here, the video sync server. It's actually the media sync server. That's a typo, but the actual library record that appears is actually stored in the database on the centralized Transana server. So for the multi-user version of Transana, you have to have some involvement from your information technology department. Your IT folks have to help you get this working because it is a complex system that involves a number of moving parts. And so getting it set up requires a little bit of IT expertise. And so what was happening there is that the server was sharing the records and the media synchronization service was making sure that Zeynab had a copy of the file. I happen to choose a file that for the sake of demonstration, Zeynab already has a copy of. If she didn't have a copy of that file, she might have to wait a couple of minutes while that transfer occurred. So Zeynab has now created math interactions. And I am not going to create a collection. I'm just going to make a selection here in my transcript. And I'm going to go down to my coding system and I'm going to choose, let's see, they're talking about flipping here. So I'm going to code that. I've made a selection and I'm going to my codes. I'm going to code it for flip. And we see that they're particularly talking about something called an up-down flip. Don't worry about what that means for right now, but I have a code for it. I have a code called flip up-down. I'm going to code that for up-down flip. Now you'll see up here in my visualization that flip, I've got flip and up-down flip and geometry because I wanted everything from this video coded with geometry. And then the fourth code is my username, David W. So those 4 keywords have been applied to this particular selection. You just watched me create those codings by double-clicking codes within my keyword node. And you will notice that Transana created a collection called Quick Quotes and Clips David W. So those are all the quick quotes and clips that I have created. Again, don't worry about what that means. If we can talk about, I do a webinar every couple of weeks of the introduction to Transana where I talk a little bit about that. So Zeynab, why don't you go ahead and code a couple of math interactions. Add a couple of clips to your math interactions, or just do quick clips if you'd rather. But you watched me do some coding. You saw me interact with my copy of Transana. Those codes all showed up automatically for Zeynab on her computer as well. So she's able to see those selections. She's able to see those codes. And she is now going to do some coding on her own that will appear on my screen as she gets that done.
Also, I'm creating a quick clips. So with the first one.
So you notice that here we have quick quotes and clips by Zeynab. That wasn't there before that. When Zeynab created that as part of creating her coding, that collection appeared. You see that there is a clip in it. And we see up in the visualization window that she coded something with the math concept of 2D versus 3D. She did the math concept of diameter. That was also coded with geometry. And that was coded with Zeynab's username to indicate that she was the one who created that. We see now that she's created another clip before mine with folding and geometry and Zeynab as the code she's applied to that. So as she and I are coding the same piece of data at the same time, those codes are showing up for each of us. We're able to see what Zeynab does. Zeynab's able to see what we do. We see she's now created a third clip here. We're able to see that coding in real time behind the scenes because of the collaborative work that multi-user Transana is allowing. So the system is recognizing when other people are working on the same data and are doing coding, and it shows us those codes in real time.
Is she able to modify or to delete any of your codes?
Yes, she is. Transana is a fully collaborative system. And so if I see something here, now as a good researcher, I will talk to Zeynab about that. And so I might go to the chat window and say, and I might say, hey, Zeynab, let's talk about coding for your clip 3. Why did she add, okay, math concepts operation. Why math concepts? And so I can send her that message. She and I we could connect through Zoom. We could connect on the phone. We could recognize that, okay, we need to talk about this. She and I would then, we could do it through the text chat, although that's rarely the most efficient way of doing it. And so we would then go and talk about it. We would make a group decision, and then it doesn't matter who, one of us would come in and we would say, well, we don't really mean operation. Instead, we mean the teaching technique of demonstration. So we would change that coding. You see that the coding then gets updated here on my screen. It's also updated on her screen. And so it is the ability to see each other's work. But yes, she can change my codes. I can change her codes, but you should absolutely have a discussion with your research team about that being something that is extremely rude if you do it without discussing things, but that is in fact the very basis of good academic collaboration. Gee, I see something, I don't understand why you coded it this way. You can explain to me why you coded it that way. I can explain to you why I think it's something different. We reach consensus together, and one of us changes the data to reflect that decision.
In another possibility is error, right? So is there any versioning going on so that we can roll back if somebody deletes a big chunk of analysis? Is there any way to roll back?
There is not a way of doing rollback. And when you have multiple people working at the same time, it got very, very difficult to say, well, I want to roll back this person's work, but not lose that person's work. And so the system does not have rollback built in because it just was, I could never come up with a way of doing that made sense, where you had enough granular control to be able to specify exactly what it was. Now, when I'm working on a project, I will do regular backups of the data. And so I always have the option of reverting to a previous backup, but that's a rather crude hammer. Again, I see that as a matter of training to the research team that nobody goes in and deletes large amounts of stuff without having a very careful discussion of that. Deletes are something that should be done extremely carefully, and you make sure that your team understands that. I see another question in the chat. Does the Transana server require dedicated hardware, or is it software that can be installed on existing hardware? That is a question for your IT department. Do they have a server that they can add the software to? If there is existing hardware, Transana is a relatively low traffic, low utilization service, so it won't particularly tax existing server hardware to add Transana services to it. But a lot of IT departments don't necessarily have that in place. The question of, Transana has to have a piece of hardware running. you don't necessarily need to purchase a separate server if your IT department already has a server running and is willing to install the software needed for Transana on it. It's not going to impact other processes. Other processes are going to have relatively minimal impact on Transana, because even if you have a dozen people working at once, the server tools that Transana uses can actually handle thousands of users, which is larger than any research project I've ever seen. So there has to be hardware somewhere, but you don't necessarily have to purchase new hardware if that hardware already exists. If several people need to discuss a bit of coding, then I recommend a tool like Zoom or WebEx or any of the traditional online meeting tools to host that discussion. I didn't see the need to write something fancier than the text chat for quick notes, because those other tools exist, and I just don't see the need to reinvent that wheel. What if not what ID? I don't know what that means, I have to admit.
It was a mistake I made in my.
Okay. Okay. Jerry would appreciate a quick discussion of TCS. That TCS is the Transana Cloud Service. One of the things that we have found is that some research projects don't have the level of IT support that it would be nice to have for something like a Transana server. And so I have set up the Transana Cloud Service, which is a subscription service where essentially a research project can use a server that I run. Let me just real quick pull up the Transana webpage. So you'll notice under products, you have Transana Multiuser. There's the Transana Cloud Service as a product. The Transana Cloud Service is essentially a way of using my server instead of having your IT department set up a server of your own. Now, if you can get your IT department to set up a server and configure it correctly, I do recommend that. If nothing else, IRBs tend to worry less about security when your IT department is in control of the server than when I am in control of the server. Now, I don't look at your data. I never have access to the media data because that's not part of what the Transana Cloud Service does. If we go back to, but the Transana Cloud Service is a way of using Transana Multiuser without the level of IT support and server setup that Transana might require to run your own server. If we go back to our diagram of the Transana setup, the Transana server here, that's what you can replace setting up your own Transana server with the Transana Cloud Service, which is basically using my Transana server. You do need to make sure that your institutional review board, whoever it is that approves your research processes at your particular university, understands that you are storing data on someone else's server and that they approve that. But that's not something, there are not data concerns about that. Because the media is never on the Transana server, I don't have access to any of that. Not that I would look at it if I did, but I do recommend standard anonymization, so not using of names or including sensitive information like social security numbers or other kinds of personal identifying information in your data set as a whole. But again, that's a discussion.
Dave, is there two or other questions?
Yeah. Okay. One is the question of the cost of a subscription. Back on the web page, on the Transana Cloud Service page under products, there are different plans that have different monthly costs based on how much you pay for at once. We do have a one-time initial setup fee because it does take some work on my part to get everything set up and configured for you to use. But as long as you maintain a consistent subscription with us, that's a one-time fee. It's cheapest on a yearly basis at $30 a month. If you just need it for a single month, the cost is higher at $50 a month. So that answers the cost question. Can the cloud service work with any time zone? Absolutely. I have done a collaboration where I was located in the Midwest in the United States. One of my collaborators was located in the UK, just outside Leeds. A third collaborator was located in South Africa, in the general area of Johannesburg. And the three of us were able to do a really nice collaboration covering three very distinct locations on the globe. So time zone is not an issue at all with the cloud service because it's available 24/7. So it's admittedly, the three of us weren't often working at the same time in that particular collaboration, but it was possible. How are individual users added to database authorizations? Is there an interface for that? With the Transana Cloud Service, there is a separate Transana Cloud Service website where there's a link for researchers, specifically where they can get in and do certain types of activities that are important to a researcher. And there is a liaison interface. When somebody signs up for the Transana Cloud Service, they name a Transana liaison. That's the person who is responsible for setting up user accounts and databases and for communicating with me any technical support issues that come up. There's an interface for liaisons to request new databases, to request new users. That is all done through a request and manual processing basis rather than automatic basis, because there are a number of security issues that I ensure as a part of the manual addition of user accounts and those kinds of things, such as that you don't have users on accessing the wrong people's data. Occasionally, the same user will need to access data from multiple projects, and that's not something that is easily automatable. So I make sure that the correct people have access to the data that they're supposed to have access to, but that nobody has access to the data that they're not supposed to, which is obviously a very important element for data security. So yes, there is a whole separate Transana Cloud Service website for those people with usernames and passwords to be able to get in and manage things like new accounts and database requests. As Zeynab points out in the chat, we're using the Transana Cloud Service for this presentation. So what you're seeing involves the Transana Cloud Service. Is there a limit to the number of collaborators? For the Transana Cloud Service, when you purchase Transana Multiuser, you get 20 authorization codes. So 20 users for a single purchase. If you have a circumstance where you need more than 20 users on a given project, you can certainly request more than that. But it's important to recognize that the Transana Cloud Service and Transana Multiuser licenses are on a project basis. So a research project can have as many accounts as they need to accomplish that. But I find that 20 tends to be more than sufficient for 99% of those. It is not an acceptable use of either Transana Multiuser or of the cloud service for example, a department to share it across multiple separate independent research projects. That would be an abuse of the license, an abuse of the subscription. And so that's separate research projects need their own separate copies of Transana Multiuser, their own separate Transana Cloud Service subscriptions. because otherwise you get, giant 40,000 student universities with one copy, and I'd go out of business. So there is not, strictly speaking, a limit. For practical intents and purposes, you're going to get 20 authorization codes. And if you need more than that, then we can have a conversation about how you're using Transana. And if you need more codes and it fits the definition of a project, then I'll give you more codes. If you're thinking about hundreds or thousands of users, then I would really strongly suggest you setting up your own server rather than using the Transana cloud service.
There's another question.
Regarding transcribing on Transana, I transcribe video. When does the program leave a timestamp to the sentences I transcribe automatically? Timestamps, okay, an excellent question. Let's go back into Transana to answer that one. Time codes are these little red marks that you see throughout this transcript. A time code represents a particular moment in time in the media file. So you can see that associated with every red mark, I'm now showing times in human readable form. Every red mark has a time associated with it. Those marks are actually added manually. That is an analytic decision where you put those time codes. It actually has analytic implications because time codes are the boundaries of your selections when you're doing coding. Transana uses time codes to determine where a selection begins and ends and where coding what the scope is for applying coding. And so entering those time codes is a manual description. I have found that automated transcription services, voice recognition systems for that are really, really bad at determining sentence boundaries, particularly because spoken language is non-grammatical in most cases, to be honest. That the way people speak, you can't always tell where there's a period and where there's a comma, and people often change what they're talking about in mid-sentence, and they have a lot of ums and pauses, and it's all a mess. And so I have not found a way of automating that. That is absolutely a manual thing that you do, but it is extremely simple. I worked hard to make insertion of time codes very, very simple. So here we have a long section. If I want to insert a time code into that, let's say I want a time code right here before the word okay. Well, to do that, it's as simple as
Just write the word symmetrical and then tell me what you think it has to do with.
So I have paused my media just before the word okay, and I'm just going to press Control T. Control T takes the spot where my media file is paused and inserts a time code with that matching time section into where my cursor is in my transcript. And so that's the process of inserting a time code. It is very simple, but it is absolutely a thing that you do as part of the transcription process or as part of the data cleanup process as you're bringing in data from Transana. Okay, there is one more piece of Transana that I want to talk about. Thank you for these questions, by the way. These questions have brought up a number of really important issues, and I'm really glad we got a chance to talk about all of that, but that means that we're running a little bit over an hour because this has been such a good discussion. But again, that is not in any way a criticism or a request that you stop asking questions, because I think that they have really enhanced the webinar quite a bit. There's another collaborative tool that Transana supports that most people don't think about, and that is collaborative writing tools. When I create a new project, particularly a multi-user project, although I use these techniques in my individual projects as well, I always create a library that I call research journals. Research journals is where shared writing occurs in my projects. You can call it whatever you want to. I happen to use research journals. And I keep a number of types of journals as I go. I keep a separate journal for each research question in many projects. If I have a project with specific multiple questions, particularly when there's a team of people, it can be very helpful to do writing about each question separately. As a standard practice, I keep something that I call daily progress. It's just a log of what happens. So if I load my daily progress we can see that on October 24th, I established this database and I imported an existing database. Then the 25th, which was yesterday, Zeynab and I had a practice session prior to the webinar, just to talk a little bit about what we were going to be doing and what her role was and what my role was. And then first thing this morning, I cleaned up the database prior to the webinars, which basically means that I removed the data from Zeynab's in my practice yesterday. So I keep a log. Every time I log into the system, I make a note of what is it that I did in this particular session. If questions come up, if I see, I noticed a lot of people are using this particular code in a way that I don't understand. Can we please talk about that at the next staff meeting? Or, I'm going to work on this section next. I'm going to be transcribing this. Or I always have transcribers record, I finished this transcript on this date. Or researchers, I coded this particular thing at this particular time. And so that's literally just a log of who did what when. That can be really helpful sometimes in looking back on things. I also actually write the first draft of my research results in Transana. And the reason I do that is that you can include links to your data. So if I add in a quote, I can actually include a link to the clip or the quote that I was pulling from. So if in that writing, if I have a quote, my colleagues can click that hyperlink in the results and it actually opens here in Transana. So I've opened that particular result.
We want you to take one of these cylinders.
I can watch the video. I can see what exactly is said. I can make sure that the transcription of the quote is correct. I can hear the emotion behind it. I can really see in depth what is happening as a result of that. If I write a note, you can write notes and attach notes to everything that you do in Transana. So if I write a note that I have this brilliant insight as I'm working, and I can, as I write the paragraph where I'm talking about that insight, I can actually include a link to that note so that they can see the original note and understand exactly what was going on there. And because Transana pulls up the clip, I can locate that clip in episode, which is what is the context of this clip. I can, by clicking this link and then going to locate the clip in episode, I can actually see the context for that particular thing. I can see what happened before. I can see what happened after. I can understand my that whole thing much better. So I find that writing okay, Transana is taking a second to load that. So that by including those links, I can really get down into my data. One of the fundamental principles of Transana is you should never be more than a click or two away from watching that video, from reading that document, from getting back to your raw data to see exactly where all of your different pieces of your analysis are coming from. And being able to include those links in my rough draft is a really great collaborative tool so that my collaborators can see what I've quoted. They can suggest alternate quotes and include those links to make arguments for what we ought to include or not include, and all of that. And so that's a really nice collaborative tool as well, is to actually be able to do the initial writing. Now, when I export this document to go into my word processor to actually, finalize the writing, all of those links are lost because Word doesn't know how to link to an object inside of Transana. But for the rough draft, for the first draft, for the work until we get pretty solidified in what we're going to say, it's a really nice tool to have. Okay, somebody has to leave. That's not unexpected when we run over like this. I see there's so if I don't leave a time mark in the transcript, I can't see the highlight of the credit. That's right. The highlight in the transcript depends upon time codes. The highlight uses time codes to determine what to highlight. If you don't have any time codes, then the program doesn't know what to highlight. So that time codes have a role in that highlighting as well. So yes, I will absolutely be sharing the link to the video when we finish up here, because people are asking for that as they have to go. Okay, that finishes up what I wanted to talk about. So I'm happy to stay here and answer questions as long as people have questions about that. But I hope that you've been able to see through the course of this webinar some of the ways that collaboration is facilitated in the multi-user version of Transana. I know, Jerry, you in particular had some technical questions that you wanted to talk about. I'm happy to stay and answer those questions. And anybody else who has questions, please join us. Thanks very much for joining us. As questions do come up, there's also a contact form on the website. You can use that to send me questions as well. So thanks for coming. If you don't have questions, you can drop off. The formal part of the webinar is over. But if you do have questions, then by all means, stick around. In the text chat, Carrie says, I use Transana for my doctorate research. I joined the webinar to find out if it might be the right thing to use for a project I'm developing, which would involve 15 parents and would involve them sharing and discussing video material. Yes, user engagement is a really interesting way of using Transana that I've seen a couple of times. It's a really nice way of doing member checking that you can show. Now you have to be a little bit careful about the whole issue of permissions and check with your IRB about who can see what, as is always true. But you can absolutely show people their videos and say, okay, here's how I interpreted this particular statement. Is that right? Is that what you meant? And you can do that. I've actually had really good results using the combination of Transana as Zoom, as you're seeing in this webinar. So it's a nice tool for member checking. It's a nice way of getting your participants involved in the coding process. If that's something that you want to have going on. Okay, other questions, and just unmute your mics and ask them directly, or you can use the chat. Either system will work.
David, I need to add something, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Especially for the collaborative work when we work together, I think something that could be very important for everybody is to when we work as a researcher, to create a book of collaboration about the things that you can do, you cannot, the definition, how to use the Transana multi-user, and it's one of the things would be important and interesting to put it in the research journal too, if you need to change or add or edit something. This is one thing that I saw in a work in a team in France, and it was very nice to see that.
Okay, Zeynab, I know that you have to go, so thank you very much for joining us here. I really appreciate your contributing to the webinar.
Thank you so much again for everybody. See you.
All right. If there are no more questions, thank you very much for coming, and let's go ahead and end the meeting.